got his degree in the University of Valencia in 1997. He got his master's thesis working on the red spot on Jupiter in 1999. He was assistant professor at the Universidad Jaume I of Castellón till 1999 to 2003, and got his PhD from University of Valencia in 2002. In 2003, he moved to UCLA, where he spent 3 years working on carbon aqueous chondrites that he is going to talk today. He's going to talk about more things about meteorites, bodies, all the stuff. He came back from UCLA in 2006 at Instituto, where he's now currently, Instituto de Estudios Espaciales in Barcelona. And last year he got a permanent position from the SIP of the physico-chemical. It's important to mention that he spent 10 years working in outreach in Planetarium of Castellón, and he has written 9 books and several dozens of articles written out with. So it's really a pleasure to have him and to have here somebody that is an expert, not just in science but also in others.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arturo. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to start today by talking about these PRIMEVAL meteorites and how these PRIMEVAL meteorites we can infer a lot of information about the origin of our solar system. So, mostly during the talk, in the first part of the talk, will be about 30 slides that will be talking about this protoplanetary disk. Is this working? Yeah. This protoplanetary disk that was around the protosun in the region of our planetary material. In particular, I'm gonna give a brief approach to the condensation and incorporation of presolar stellar grains into the PRIMEVAL materials that will be represented here at micron scale. Will be in just this figure here. We are just observing a tiny portion of the primitive disk of materials that with the passing of time and at very different scales, kilometer scale, will be here represented as a small, tiny portion of one primitive asteroid, as we can today study. And of course, from these asteroids are coming meteorites today. So, if I'm going to the right, yeah. I'm going to start by this section about protoplanetary disks and meteorites, how we can link the astrophysical evidence with the meteorite evidence, how the primitive meteorites are sampling the solar system, what kind of information we can get from chondrites, particularly they are a legacy about our own origins in the solar system, in the universe, so they are really exciting materials. On the other hand, I'm just trying to introduce some of the astrophysical processes that are behind the formation, particularly of calcium-aluminum-rich inclusions, are called, this acronym in English is usually said like CAIs. that are the most primitive materials that are just condensed on the nebula, not the most primitive materials that are in primitive meteorites, because stellar grains from other stars were also incorporated. And also I will go about these chondrules that are also very interesting materials to understand some of the processes that were happening in the solar nebula. And I also discuss how from the different isotopic anomalies inherited in these materials, we got very interesting information about the astrophysical environment where the solar system formed. And finally, a few slides, about 10 slides, will be just giving some idea of the work we are doing in recovering some of these meteorites that are just crossing our skies over Iberian Peninsula. Particularly some of our discoveries about the delivery from NEOs, from near-Earth objects, of possible meteorites. This is a field we are just working right now, in some conclusions. So, just to start, well, the first evidence of really the violent environment where the solar system formed was got indirectly from the astrophysical observations where the young stellar objects, these Herwin-Haro systems that are surrounding regions of stellar formation, are typically showing these jets of gas that are just leaving these protoplanetary systems. Typically, these ISOs are formed in molecular clouds that are enriched by nucleosynthetic products, different inherited materials from the surrounding environment. Typically, they are formed the first stages of stellar formation. With Tauri, for example, systems are characterized by very strong stellar winds, strong magnetic fields, and also this environment where we can just we have a gas-rich environment that are subject to different processes, really energetic processes that are just giving shape to all of these materials that were in the protoplanetary system. Just a simplified brief sequence of the solar system is just giving interesting clues. This is a historical view of the full process. We were just more or less middle of the past century asking ourselves about what was the origin of the matter that was falling into the planetary disk. We now know that not all chemical and isotopic fingerprints were erased because the nebula was not so hot as the first models by Cameron and Lewis were just proposing. This means that not only we have in the primitive meteorites materials that are direct condensates from the gases that were in the nebula, if not, we also, in these materials, we have evidence of stellar grains that were formed around in other stellar sources. This is a really exciting point because we can infer some of the conditions in which the solar system was formed. It's particularly the evidence of isotopic anomalies and PRESOLAR grains in these primitive meteorites is a really hot spot, hot search in present knowledge about the solar system and also astrophysical research. We know that the planetesimals, that the first bodies that accreted from the protoplanetary disk, were growing very fast. In fact, the simulations and the different models that have been studied are proposing that time scales about 3 to 5 million years after condensation of sea ice, these materials, these asteroids and comets, were already formed. So the building blocks of planets, in particular, here represented the formation of a comet in the outer part of the nebula, where not only mineral grains were incorporated, also were incorporated ices and organic matter that was in the other part of the nebula, were forming at very low relative velocities. As a consequence, these building blocks, depending on the formation region, incorporated different compositional patterns, different isotopic patterns that were characteristics of the different regions where the solar system, in which they form in the solar system. So, a good example of this is a typical temperature profile of a solar top light. I apologize because here I didn't got the right graph in English. It's in Spanish. I think you will understand. Take some time, this pointer. So here is the formation temperature for the this will be the full profile from near the Sun, 0.5 astronomical units until 10 astronomical units. These are the positions of the planets at present time, not at that time, at the origin, because in fact Jupiter and Saturn were formed far away and were migrating inside the solar system. And particularly we have here that the profile is just showing that the ordinary chondrites, ensatite chondrites from which the Earth was formed, just formed from materials that were condensing at very high temperatures. In the opposite, just in the outside part of this profile, we have here the condensation of organic matter, more or less at the outer edge of the main belt of asteroids, and the condensation of ices, more or less at the distance where Jupiter is at present time. So the composition of the protoplanetary disk and the materials that were accreting from the nebula was different depending on the heliocentric distance. So this is an important, crucial parameter in order to understand how the protoplanets were formed. In order to understand what were the products of these high temperature processes that were happening in the nebula, we got, fortunately, these extremely primitive materials. In particular, Asper-94, one of meteorites, one carbonaceous chondrite that I got just the chance to study at UCLA, is the most primitive carbonaceous chondrite known so far. This meteorite, for example, contains the highest abundance in stellar grains, and is quite similar to a CM. It's a group. I will talk in the next slide about the different groups of carbonaceous chondrites, but this is a very, very exciting group that, in particular, this is linked to the CM group. The interesting thing of this group of carbonaceous chondrites is that is very highly, I will say, highly aqueously altered. The members of this group have been very altered by water, except this guy. And just this guy is extremely rich in PRESOLAR grains. So we were just working on this in very detail. So the different groups we have of carbonaceous chondrites, for example, we find the CDs and COs. These acronyms are coming from the C. The initial C comes from carbonaceous, and the second letter is coming from the first meteorite type that was identified. In this case, Bigarano, Ornans, Dumuluthi, Nigei, and Ibuna. In fact, all these rocks are coming from water-rich bodies. They are containing chondrules. This, for example, is Murchison meteorite, the first meteorite in which, for example, amino acids were found by Professor Joan Oró in Houston. For example, most of these groups are rich in water, until even more than 10% in mass of water, about 3-4% in mass of carbon. They are carbon-rich and water-rich bodies, well represented by these groups that are just in this graph over here. We have different petrologic types. The pre-type means that it's not thermal alteration, and in this direction we found metamorphism. They are materials that have been incorporated to increasing size bodies even larger in this way. So the temperature that these materials suffered was higher than these ones that are in this following. In the other direction, we have aqueous alteration. They are 2 degrees of aqueous alteration, and the most altered meteorites are the CI group of carbonaceous chondrites. They are another types of ordinary chondrites and enstatite chondrites so far. Just mention that the most similar materials to the composition of the Earth, probably the building blocks of our planet, were in fact these enstatite chondrites. That, as we can see here, are materials that have suffered different degrees of increasing thermal alteration. That's an interesting point. But inside, in the tiny minuscule grains that are in these materials, what we are finding? Well, for example, with this technique, this is an ion microprobe image, where we are just putting the different X-ray maps at different colors. We can see here that it's really easy to see the difference between the carbonaceous matrix. This is Asperonine 4, the same meteorite I was just discussing about. Quite disturbing, these figures, quite difficult. So this is the matrix of the meteorite, really tiny, micro-sized materials, mostly carbon-rich, but also condules, tiny fragments of condules. But here we can see that this tonality is very different to the typical color, magnesium color, that will be the red one, that is characteristic of the glass that is forming the condules. In particular, this is a CAI, that this is a calcium aluminum rich inclusion. This is typically formed by refractory minerals like espinel, melilite, ebonite, and so forth. So probably those of you that are working on stellar conditions and formation of stellar grains in stars, you will identify that some of these phases are there. In fact, you can see remotely these materials. And they also got incorporated in these PRIMEVAL materials that fortunately are getting to our labs. So the CIs retain in these minerals a big variety of isotopic anomalies. They are rich in oxygen 16, 26 aluminum, 53 manganese, and so on, that are probably inherited from the incompletely homogenized presolar materials from the incompletely homogenized solar nebula. It's a mixture between the gases that were coming from nearby stars and the solar nebula materials. That is a very, very exciting conclusion of this study. So the typical scenario for CAI and AOI, that is another type of inclusion, is one when you have the initial conditions of formation of a star, very intense magnetic profile, most of the material that is in the protoplanetary disk got stored in this region in the way that the CI precursors could be just accumulating over here. That's the reason, because these materials were, we have evidence, these CAIs are compact materials mostly made by calcium aluminium oxides and suffer different degrees of heating. In fact, most of them have different layers. A good evidence that were heat and reheat several times. The typical time scales everything is there you go. It's like a stack. So in this scenario, the flares that were induced by the stretching of magnetic fields in this part of the inner part of the protoplanetary disk will be just producing these X-ray flares that are able to vaporize most of the materials that were forming these clumps of dust. It means that the condensates probably were also not only calcium aluminium, if not also magnesium, silicon, and other materials, but as a consequence of this reheating, most of these materials were vaporized with time. The conduits are these spherules that are glassy in structure, are different silicates that were incorporated in the chondrite, and in fact are so abundant that is the typical feature from which the name chondrites comes from chondrus, chondrite. Some of these chondrules, in fact, were also produced by heating. Initial micro-sized particles that were just heated and forming glassy spherules that in few hours or perhaps a few days just cool away the heat and form in the protoplanetary disk these glassy spherules that were later on incorporated in the chondrite. There is, in the last decade, I should discuss, for example, the models by Alan Boss that is just suggesting for most of these materials, we don't know so far for sure what kind of phenomena were just producing the heat. One proposal was just made by this gravitational unstable protoplanetary disk that has been modelized by Alan Boss, where we can see, for example, that the movement of the big planets in the solar system was producing like gravity waves that are moving the material in the protoplanetary disk and promoting friction between the materials until the point that more or less the temperature of these tiny grains, typically initially micron size, is reaching about 1 6,500 Kelvin, the temperature, of melting of these materials, and in such conditions they are transformed into compounds. So we have a plenty of information, a lot of materials that are giving clues about these PRIMEVAL materials that were in the protoplanetary disk. The short-lived radionuclides were just incorporated during the condensation of mineral phases in the solar nebula, the sea ice, condensation, and so on. Also, a few noble gases were retained in the matrix, in the tiny matrix that is just compacting the chondrites. And also we got PRESOLAR grains from nearby stars and fine dust materials, some of them representative of the interstellar nebula. Just a few examples of the stellar sources of radionuclides that we got in meteorites. These are the typical isotopes we find in meteorites, and except the beryllium-10 that today we identify as bor 10, that is a spallation product produced in the nebula. The rest of these isotopes are coming from different types of stars. Supernovae, massive AGBs, moderate mass AGBs can explain some of them. We have been, in fact, working on a model that I will discuss in few slides ahead. The important point of the presence of these radionuclides in the PRIMEVAL materials that were the building blocks of planets is that, particularly those that were more abundant, aluminium-26 and iron-60, is that when they decayed in the interior of these planetesimals, that were the building blocks of planets, this decay was heating the materials. If we have bodies accreting and getting large until over more or less 60, 100 kilometers, there is a point in which the decay is just producing so amount of heat that the heat is unable to escape and leave the body. In consequence, we have melting. For these big bodies of the solar system that we call planetary bodies, not only planets, if not also moon, some of the big satellites in the solar system, for these large bodies, we got differentiation, separation, chemical separation, segregation of the metal from silicates, formation of cores inside these bodies, formation of a mantle. We will see some of the meteorites that are also evidence of these processes in the biggest bodies. And of course, if there is magmatic processes in these really big bodies, we obtain these echondrites. Echondrites are materials that have no chondrules. Why? Because these are secondary minerals formed after the recrystallization of the melts. That's the basic idea. A good example coming from asteroid Vesta was discovered by our group in 2007 is this Puerto Lápice eucrite that I just brought with me also for your enjoyment, where we can link the chemistry, the mineralogy of this meteorite with Vesta, with the other part of Vesta, with the eucritic crust of this large asteroid, but also we can link with the oxygen isotopic data. For the first time, I'm working with colleagues here at the Instituto Astrofísica de Canarias. Arturo Manchado, Aníbal García Hernández, and Pedro García Lario at the SAC, we were just able to get a model where we fit the abundances in collaboration with María Lugaro and Amanda Caracas, outside researchers, Italian researchers. We were just able to model the initial abundances of short-lived nuclides. How? Just making a model of a 6.5 solar masses asymptotic giant branch, called the acronym is AGB star, that would be just close enough to the solar nebula to incorporate these gases emanating from the star after these thermal pulses that are just the stages before the formation of the planetary nebula, that just were mixing with the protoplanetary disk or solar nebula gases. If we just consider one dilution factor of about 1 part of AGB material per 300 parts of solar nebula material, we just got the right abundances for the first time. It's quite exciting, this result, because for about 40 years other researchers have been looking and proposing supernovae as source of most of these radionuclides. Just with one model and one type of star is at least is quite indicative. It's not, of course, this is open to future research, but we are just working in the right direction, perhaps, to understand in which environment the solar system forms. Between the stellar grains, these condensates that are forming in the photospheres of these nearby stars and are just releasing these materials and incorporating to the Milky Way and, of course, to the solar nebula, we have all these evidence. Of course, some of these grains are not from nearby stars. Some can be perfectly from other stars, like, for example, supernovae, J stars, novae, red giants, AGBs, and so on. We find all this variety of stellar grains with different typical sizes and abundances. I will just focus on the silicon carbide evidence that is just giving clues about the probably rich AGB environment where the solar system forms. First of all, I would just like to focus in that our present techniques to identify presolar grains, stellar grains, in these meteorites is by looking at images like this one, where we can identify different really tiny grains where the stellar grains are visible because of extreme isotopic differences. That's the basic idea. If we find a presolar grain, we identify that presolar grain from the environment. Of course, this technique has also important biases. So this is some of the ways we are also looking for presolar grains. Among the results, these are results by Lavers and Amari in 2005 with the silicon carbide grains. As we can see here, most of these silicon carbide grains that are represented and called mainstream silicon carbide are here represented. So is this cluster that we can see over here. This is the carbon 12-15 and nitrogen 14-15 ratios. So we can identify the different stellar sources of these grains. The mainstream, about 93% of all the measured stellar grains of this class, silicon carbide, are coming from AGBs, particularly from low mass AGBs. One of the big questions is if we were able to fit the abundances of short life nuclides by using a 6 solar masses AGB, why we are not finding those stellar grains in this graph? Perhaps our techniques are biasing those products, are too tiny for our techniques, or perhaps we are looking wrong to the data, or perhaps we are not expecting silicon carbide grains. Of course, we need to learn a lot, particularly in the outer parts of these nearby stars. We need to learn about the non-equilibrium chemistry condensation products. That's an important point. So the formation scenario is just mostly a conclusion of this part. About 4.6 gigayears ago, the collapse of the solar nebula occurs. Some presolar grains were embedded in the dust where the solar system was formed. In the hot nebula regions, the first refractory minerals formed by evaporation and were heat in order to produce the CAIs. About 4,567 million years ago, the first condensate, the CAIs, formed. About 1-2 million years after that age, the condule formation took place, probably by different processes, perhaps the shocks, gravity waves we were just discussing. And later on, all these components were accreting into the chondrites parent bodies, chondrite asteroids, in order to first to create the first building blocks of planets. And since then, most of these objects have suffered different processes. Some of them will be thermal metamorphisms as consequence of that the materials got incorporated into larger bodies, or aqueous alteration for those small bodies that were incorporating important amounts of water in their interiors. So I have been particularly studying, in collaboration with Professor Jürgen Blum and Braunschweig University in Germany, the pathway from small to large. I will just discuss a few details. It's quite interesting that, of course, some of these asteroids we have in the main belt are just remnants of the bodies that were not gravitationally scattered or accreted into the planet. So these small bodies are particularly interesting, especially in one epoch right now, in that we are just planning missions to primitive bodies in the solar system. We have a few targets, in fact, and a lot of expectations of recovery of materials of these primitive asteroids. Just the spacecraft near Shoemaker was going these exciting results about Eros asteroid, ordinary chondrite progenitor asteroid, and of course another very successful mission was Hayabusa of a Japanese agency that was studying asteroid Itokawa. So in the laboratory experiments we were just making in Germany, we just were working with simules of these tiny materials. In this laboratory experiment with a cogwheel, we were just producing the same typical velocities, more or less about 50 meters a second, that have been obtained in the models of occasion of planetesium. So from this experiment, we got this agglomerate that we can see here in the different types of grains that were used. And from this, we performed some experiments to study the tensile strength determination, where we got really interesting clues. And the most important clue is that all meteorites that are arriving to the surface, probably most of them, are compacted samples. There is a natural bias as a consequence of history, evolution in the solar system, collisions. The meteorites that are arriving to Earth are biased towards the toughest objects in the solar system. Those materials that are high strength are surviving with more probability. At the same time, those that are arriving to the top of the atmosphere with cracks, with fractures, those materials have less opportunity to survive. So these materials are also biased during the atmospheric interaction. That is really interesting, because this is telling us that if we want to look for the materials that have the porosities and the typical tensile strength we are getting in the laboratory, we need to look not for meteorites, but for comets. And Stardust was just giving additional clues in this study. I was lucky enough to participate in the preliminary examination team of this mission. We were just studying all the interaction of these particles, really fragile particles, fragile aggregates, formed by hundreds of nanometers to micron-sized particles, forming clusters that impacted in this cell. You can see here. Okay, this is just a schematic scenario, seeing how the spacecraft overflew the coma of comet Will 2, and here we have just the aerogel, silicon dioxide aerogel. This will be a section of one of these cells of aerogel where the particles were penetrating. Here is the top of the aerogel, and this is a section of the tracks produced by the particles in the interaction. Below, we have these surviving materials here, these mineral grains, but also on the walls produced during the interaction, we got interesting materials. Just a few examples. I'm just going the right way to end the first part of the talk. So this is an example of one of the particles. This was quite surprising, the fact that in one of the surviving particles at the end of the track, we can see this troy-like grain over here that in fact located in this frontal position was allowing the survival of these tiny materials that are representative of the materials that were consolidated in the other part of the nebula where this comet was formed. If we look in detail with the transmission electron microscope to that region, look at this. This is just a nitrogen-15 hotspot over here that will be representative of the typical interstellar, or at least outer region of the solar system chemistry. So this is in our labs now. Many groups are working, in fact, on these exciting materials of this form. And the most exciting, probably, result is the fact that some of these mineral grains were formed in the interior, in the inner part of this protoplanetary disk. So they were formed under high temperature environment. They are not amorphous silicates, but crystalline. And this is a really exciting confirmation of different models, astrophysical environment models by Bockeley Morvan, et al., different authors, but this is just a really, really nice result. Look at the scale. There is a few microns inside this genuine cometary volume. So, and the thing is that we don't need to go only to comets. These particles are reaching the Earth every night. These really fragile particles, when they are smaller than a few microns, in fact, when they penetrate in the atmosphere, they can irradiate the heat very efficiently. So they are surviving. These particles are called interplanetary dust particles, and also contain information about the processes that are taking place in the other part of the nebula. For example, these tiny silicate particles
are basically, in our video systems, we are putting in front of the lens diffraction grating, so we can get chemical information, just the lines, the spectral lines of each fireball that is entering in the atmosphere. Okay, this is a. No. It's continuously. It's just filming a spectrum. This is given by the stream of the video. So the video rate is 1/25 of second, typically. So we have this temporal resolution at the present time. Of course, some of the spectra are the resolution is quite moderate. So, but we have some important clues about the abundance of the rocky elements in the meteorite that is producing the luminous phase. So, in fact, this was part of my PhD. I was working on the job observatory in the Czech Republic on meteor spectra and fireball spectra, and we can just model the bulk chemistry of the rocky elements quite well. Of course, it's not the same precision for sure that in the laboratory, but we have some clues about what is the chemical similitude with different chondrite gases or irons or different things. Thank you.
You say that IDPs can be collected in the upper. How do you do that, and how you can say this is an IDP and not dust particle?
Because these particles retain the same isotopic anomalies that we are observing in primitive chondrites. In fact, we can know from solar tracks even the time. There are different techniques to get clues about the time that the IDP reached the atmosphere. So this is the typical work that has been doing by NASA and different colleagues. George Flynn just made a very, very good approach to these studies. And particularly are the future materials of scientific success in this area, because are really tiny materials that are sampling bodies that probably never will be visited by our spacecrafts. There are so many bodies in the solar system that we won't afford to manage missions to those comets. So I think the full thing is very, very exciting and suggestive of the future work that the new laboratories are able to do on really tiny particles that are giving clues on the formation in the outer part of the nebula. This last one, perhaps.
Nice. For example, the material that you see with a single event, like 6 solar masses in the sky, is there any prospect that you could find
This is quite difficult because, in fact, the main thing is that we don't know for sure the distance at which the star was when the solar system formed. We don't know the time scales of. We have some approaches to the time scales of solar system formation, but at least we are able, fortunately, to say that some of these stars were nearby the sun everything started, everything in our local time, I will say.
Also relate our material to Vesta, for example. Is that really related to Vesta or family of
In particular, when we are speaking about Vesta, I have avoided one slide where I was just discussing the oxygen isotopic ratios for different solar system bodies. The main thing is that in the same way that the protoplanetary disk has a differentiated chemical composition as a function of the heliocentric distance, at the same time is produced different oxygen isotopic ratios as a function of this distance, particularly because they are different models that are trying to explain this, but the different oxygen isotopes are in that stage of the solar system were sealed by carbon monoxide. This is one of the hypotheses that has been made. So the amount of the different oxygen isotopic ratios were changing as a function of the distance. And these oxygen isotopic ratios were incorporated in the materials at the different positions. So the thing, just the conclusion of that is that oxygen isotopic data can be used to infer from which body in the solar system is coming one meteorite. Particular, for example, meteorites from Mars, I got just one sample here, is giving a peculiar oxygen isotopic ratio. Materials from Vesta have a typical peculiar oxygen isotopic ratio, and so on. I didn't get the name of meteorite.
HAD.
Ah, okay.
I mean, are we sure they all came from Vesta and not from other of the E-type clusters that are around that are not linked to the...
That's a good point. Okay, in Vesta, we know that the southern part of Vesta have a big crater that, in fact, has been invoked as the origin of the Vestoids, the different asteroids that are around the main belt that have a chemical affinity, mineralogy, to Vesta. We can say that the HED meteorites, that HED is the acronym for Howardites, Euclides, and Diogenites, the different types of materials that are presumably coming from Vesta. We have obtained, colleagues have obtained reflectant spectra of Vesta and compared these reflectant spectra with the spectra from these meteorites, and there is a almost perfect match. So we know that the materials are similar, but this is a good point. The answer that we have nowadays, that I always say, I think we are safe enough to say that HEDs, 99% of accuracy, are coming from Vesta. Why? Because it's quite likely that all these Vestoids were, some of them at least, coming from these big craters that suffer Vesta. Particularly because some of these Vestoids are close to the most important regions of resonance, mean motion resonance with Jupiter and Saturn that are in the outer part mainly of the solar system, of the main belt. So these HED meteorites that are reaching the Earth, 99% of them have the same oxygen isotopic data. Why we should say that are coming from another asteroid? It's possible, but I think it's quite unlikely. And this is more or less the community idea. in general. I won't speak for everybody, but in general, there is a big consensus until, of course, some samples will be recovered of these large asteroids. But with one big exception, I will say. We know, for example, that iron meteorites, like this one, there are 13 types of irons reaching the Earth. It means that at least, if these are representative of the cores of these large asteroids, at least 13 of these big asteroids were destroyed in the past. Are perhaps some of these AGBs, or most of these AGBs, coming from one body that just disappeared? Well, there is a possibility. And perhaps we are just missing the right question. But in general, the general opinion is that the AGBs, these 99% of chondrites with a peculiar oxygen isotopic pattern, are coming from Vesta. But of course, it's not completely for sure. It's just until we got samples from Vesta. Like we got samples from the moon. Going there is just the solution. So thank you very much for your interest. And I enjoyed very much talking here today. Thank you. ¿Podemos dar la luz? ¿Podemos dar aquí la luz? Sí. Una muestra. Es una pequeña muestra de los materiales que tenemos allí en el laboratorio en Barcelona. Por supuesto, quedáis todos invitados a venir por Barcelona y sería un placer mostraros con microscopio, etcétera, con otras condiciones, algunos de estas zonas.
Te presento a Irene Pinto,
Irene,
que es
muy
una...
bien.
Puerto, perdón, es que es otra, que hay dos. Que es una nueva adquisición que tenemos aquí en el IAC. Es experta en